My name's Joe. I'm a vet in North, and this evening I'm going to tell you about a European Innovation Partnership project I've been running on some of my clients' farms. We've called the project Implementing Advanced Nutritional Management in the Welsh Sheep Industry. Essentially, farmers wanted to focus on trace elements, but we tried to make the remit broader than that because actually they're only one part of the nutritional story. So the aim of the project, it was an implementation project, so we wanted to do something. We didn't set out to research a question or to particularly try and find the answer to something. What we wanted to do was to try and do good nutrition on these farms. They really wanted to focus on trace elements, so that was a big part of the project, but we couldn't do that exclusion. So obviously we also looked at energy and protein, which is the key macronutrients, and also we wanted to consider other concurrent diseases that may also affect production and nutrition, such as parasites or lameness or whatever. So I'm going to briefly blast through the trace elements we looked at. There's only a slide, there's only one slide per element, so there's not going to be a huge amount of details, just to quickly illustrate those. And then I'm going to just run through one farm, and that will fill the time. So copper, I've put that at the top of the list because it's often one I'm asked about and we talk about, and it's all the most complicated to get right, as will become apparent. It's useful in lots of things. It helps the body absorb iron, and it's used to make hemoglobin, which carries oxygen in blood. It's also used in systems. And we'll all be familiar with the sort of classic pictures of bloated cattle when they're deficient, and that's because the hair depigments. But this sort of classic presentation in sheep would be where deficiency occurs, it would be with swayback in lambs. But that isn't the only presentation. There would be other effects you might see, such as a reduced ability to fight infection. So you may just find that the lambs get more infection, point tail or watery mouth or something like that. And you can also get scouring and things like that. So there's part of the issue with copper is that it interacts with other elements, so it can just be prevented from being absorbed by the consumption of iron. So if there's quite a lot of iron around, that can reduce the availability, and it can also bind sulfur and molybdenum to make this thing called thiomolybdate, which can prevent its absorption as well. So it's quite complicated to manage. It's also one that has a narrow safety threshold, so it's quite easy to overdo it and kill animals with copper, and different breeds of sheep absorb it more or less well. So it's quite a lot to take into account, and it's not just a case of shoving copper in sheep will make all your dreams come true. Cobalt, we often think about in terms of lambs and in lamb growth, and that would be where it would be most important. The sheep actually need vitamin B12, that's what they require, but they make that from cobalt. Well, the rumen bugs make that from cobalt, and they produce the vitamin B12, which is what the sheep actually needs. Where there's a lack of cobalt, you get thrift is the classic sign, and have diarrhea as well, and generally we just see these sort of poor doer sheep. There is an interaction with worms, so it'll to tease out which is the cause. So if there are lots of worms, that can reduce the ability to absorb cobalt, but if there's low cobalt, that can also increase the number of worms that the sheep carries. So it's quite hard to distinguish first. Selenium, we also looked at selenium, and a lot of the farming in our project needed some supplementation with selenium because the ground was low in it. It's useful in the body because it helps absorb and retain vitamin E, and is also involved in iodine absorption. Such help protect cell membranes, and both vitamin E and selenium are also very important in immunity alongside copper. So where we haven't got selenium, you can get more infections, and you can have reduced growth and general ill thrift. Zinc is often overlooked, but there's a few studies that look at zinc, and it's important in skin, hair, and horn, alongside some other elements. But it's also useful in hormones, action of antibodies, and immunity. So where there's a deficiency, there can be growth and immunity effects. It's possible to overdo it with zinc, but it's got quite a wide safety margin. It's less frightening to deal with than copper and selenium. We looked at manganese in this project partly just because it came in the test packages. It sort of came alongside. It's rarely a problem in sheep, it's more of a problem in cattle. But I would just include it here because it's one we've got some numbers on. Manganese is important in the activation of some enzymes and also in the formation of bone. So when there is a severe deficiency, the symptoms tend to be angular, where the long bones of the lamb are wonky and they can't walk properly. So that there are other things that cause that. So if you see those on your farm, you can't just say, oh, it's manganese deficiency, but it's something to consider at the time. Unfortunately, due to various technical issues, we were unable to assess iodine in this project, so we won't touch on it in the data, which was a shame because it's, again, can be problematic in Wales, in that there are useful function of thyroid hormones, and the thyroid regulate the body's metabolism, and are important in immune function again. So here's immunity again. And when there's a deficiency in iodine, we see reproductive problems. So in severe cases, you can get abortion, just failure to conceive, which might just manifest as a low scanning percentage, or it can in the lamb with just weak lambs, and in severe cases, this goiter where you get a big swelling under the jaw. You can overdo iodine as well. So that's sort of a quick whistle-stop tour through treatment, and there are some books written on it, so we by no means have covered it all at all. But in this project, what we set out on 12 farmers together, and first of all, we assessed what they'd been doing before. Took a sort of detailed questionnaire of the disease history on the farm and the production history, and then also where the farmers were intending to go in terms of their production aims. We then took forage samples from the farm. Now this was farm specific, so we only had enough money to do 3 samples per farm, so we tried to split across the farm to try and represent the farm as best we can. So if there was some pasture higher than others or of a different type, that would form one sample, and then that'd be a lower part or another type, that would form another sample. And then we'd try and take a conserved forage sample as well, either silage or hay, depending on what was planned for the winter. We took blood samples at various stages throughout the project to we use those to give us a snapshot of the energy and protein status of the ewe, so its metabolic status. And then we also looked at various markers in the blood to tell us something about the trace elements. And we'll come in a bit more detail as I go on. Looked for evidence of concurrent disease using the blood sample as well. So there are some cells that increase and go down in different disease. So we could look at that, and that might just say, well, actually, there's something going on here which we need to investigate. We took feces samples at various times to look at parasites. So we're looking at flucan worms. And then what was fairly unusual in this project, in this context, was we used liver tissue biopsies from the ewes as well. So I should have said the focus of this project was to look at the ewe rather than the ewe and lamb. It would have made it too big to look at the ewe and the lamb. But our focus was to look at the ewe and to manage her correctly. And then if we can produce well from the ewe, we can then think about the lamb subsequently. So there'll be ongoing work with these farmers privately to, once we've sorted out nutritional management, to then take that on and focus on the lamb as well. If you wanted to do something similar with your own vet, then do the two concurrently. This makes it more complicated in terms of when to do what and which button to press when. So in this project, we're just looking at the ewe. So I've just put some pictures in of the liver biopsy technique. So it's the reason we do this is that you're sampling from the productive ewe. So other ways of getting liver tissue samples are to take them from cull ewes that are going to the abattoir, and then you can collect those in the abattoir after evisceration, or you can collect them similarly from lambs. But if we collect them from lambs, we don't know what we're doing with the ewe. And often it depends how the lambs are reared. So if they've been fed concentrate feed, then actually we're assessing the ability of the lamb to grow on concentrate feed, not just off grass. And one of the other focuses of this project was to try and work as much as possible off grass. The reason to take a liver tissue sample rather than just use blood samples, which you may be more familiar with, is something different. Element status of the ewe. Blood samples can give us short and medium term results. So for example, the element copper, we can measure plasma or serum copper, which is useful, but it essentially tells us what the ewe has consumed in the last couple of weeks. We can also measure some enzymes which can tell us something a bit further back in the history of the ewe. So for example, the enzyme glutathione peroxidase, which can give us an angle on the selenium status of the ewe, is found in red blood cells, and we know the red blood cells live for 2 to 3 months, so we can assess that it tells us something about the selenium status over that period of time, but not much longer. Now, a lot of these elements are excreted through the liver, and their concentration within the liver tissue fluctuates much more slowly over time. And so having a liver tissue sample alongside the blood sample means we can look at the short, medium and long-term assimilation of these elements, and therefore make a more long-term plan moving forward. So what we do is restrain the ewe. We choose random ewes from the flock, because otherwise you're sort of cherry picking ones and you're going to make a flock decision. And we restrain her on the left side, and then we shave the wool off so that we can prepare it as if we were going to do an operation. Then put some anesthetic where we're going to put the needle, the biopsy needle, and then make a little cut with a scalpel. Then put the biopsy needle through the chest and into the and aspirate the liver tissue from the ewe in that way. Once we've got the blood with it, we then store the liver tissue sample in a sterile tube before sending it to the lab. So that obviously it's not a huge sample, but it does tell us something about the ewe when we pair it with the blood. So I'm now just going to. It's nice to sort of go through the data for all the farms in a bit more of a together way, but in time to do that properly. So what I'm going to do is just show you what we did on one of the farms. They were all different. There was also something different about all of them, and some of them we could pat ourselves on the back and think we'd done a really good job, and others didn't go so well. And I've deliberately chosen this one because it didn't go so well, and it's to illustrate the complexity of trying to manage trace elements within the dynamic situation. And it hopefully highlights that you can't just take some random sample and think that's going to tell you everything. You need to be able to sort of look backwards and forwards at the same time and use the information that you have to make adjustment and then monitoring it going forward. So hopefully you'll see the benefit of monitoring on this farm as we wade through it. So it's a lowland farm. He farms mule ewes with some white veg texels in it. His aim is to have a scanning percentage of 180%, and he has the known specific disease issues which we were aware of. Is he does parasitic gastroenteritis in his lambs. That's caused by worms. And hopefully in your head there's already going off the light bulb that may be related to cobalt, although we don't investigate that in this topic. And he also has issues with fluke, which may be familiar to many of you, and he also has issues with foot rot and cod particularly. So all those things will affect production and affect the ewe and need to be taken into consideration when making adjustments. So we started off with a pre-analysis. Now, as with all the best laid plans, this was slightly late, so we were a bit too close to supping for comfort, and that has an effect. But we managed to get forage samples, and we managed to get 2 samples. Sheep essentially set stocked for most of the year on just a huge lowland floodplain. So we took a grass sample from that, and then we took a silage sample because that's what they would be fed when housed for lambing. So I've just put a quick summary of the macro elements, calcium and phosphate, are essential to be present at the right concentration, but more importantly in the right ratio. And that was fine. That was okay to start with. We then noted that the magnesium was high. Now that's not necessarily a problem, but the next line down, the potassium is also high. Now potassium goes on as part of fertilizer, so it's often high on pasture, but that can inhibit the absorption of magnesium in when the sheep eats the grass. And so there's a warning there that grazing these pastures and eating this silage, they may be at risk of staggers in the spring and autumn. So that's nothing new, but it's borne out in the forage analysis. In the grass, the copper concentration was okay, and it was sort of borderline okay in the silage, but we had high amounts of iron, which is can inhibit the absorption of copper. And also in the grass, we had quite a bit of iron and molybdenum and sulfur, and they can combine together in the room and the blood actually to prevent the absorption and use of copper in this thing called thiamolybdate. So the copper may be okay, but it may not be okay in the sheep. So we need to look in the sheep to find out how they're managing on this grass. The selenium was low in both samples, and that's common across many of the flocks we looked at in this project. Zinc was okay, and manganese was high, and the cobalt was okay in the grass. When you take a grass sample and look at cobalt, you need to know what time of year it is, and that's true for quite a few elements, but I'm just going to focus briefly on cobalt. It tends to go down in the summer with drying, and then it tends to increase over the winter with the increased rainfall. So the silage may have be low the time of year it was made, and we're coming into autumn when we took these samples, so the cobalt may have just increased during the autumn. Moving on, we looked at the sheep at this time. Now, I don't know if you can cast your mind back to 2018. Was incredibly dry. Everywhere was crispy, and there was a lack of forage where, and these sheep were extremely thin. Their body condition score was average 1.5 out of 5, and pre-tapping I'd want them at body condition score 3 to 3.5. This unfortunately was a bit of a slap in the face, and was too late to do much about at this point. You know, and we were in real problems, but sort of said, well, look, we need to be supplementing these sheep several months ago with forage or something in order just to keep the condition on. There was no, sorry about that. There was no fluke or worse identified in the feces sample pre-tapping, but we know the farm was likely to infect the sheep at some point, that we just used the NARDIS forecast moving forward to time fluke treatments as planned. On the bloods, surprise, surprise, they were low energy and protein, which was not at all a surprise given the body condition score of the sheep. So then we looked at the trace elements, and combining the blood and liver results together, some of the sheep had normal coppers, so you'll remember back to the forage, so some had normal, some were low, and some were very low. So straight away that creates a problem in what are you going to do about the flock as a whole, because clearly some sheep are desperate for copper and some are coping fine. Selenium was low, so that matches well with the forage. The cobalt was okay. Forage at that point in time. The zinc was marginally low, which could just be reflective of been for so long. And again, similarly, manganese, looking at the forage, they were okay. So in summary, really, we identified various, top one being body condition score of the ewes, just a lack of grass. They said put together, but on balance, they needed some copper supplementation, and to last her through pregnancy up to lambing, a long-term source of copper would have been most ideal. But by the time we got the results, these ewes had already been supplemented with a copper drench, so a problem in terms of adding in another copper source, in that we're at risk of potentially causing toxic effects in some of the ewes. So we decided to continue with repeating in pregnancy, so with another drench given at around scanning time, in the hope that that would be sufficient to last them through. The drench that had been used also contained selenium, so, and that, because it becomes bound in enzymes, was likely to last better and provide selenium needed going through, particularly if there was a second one given. The zinc well, there's some slightly low, but they were likely to manage off the forage given the concentration there, and as it had started to rain in the autumn, so there would hopefully be a growth in the autumn up the zinc. But it could have been supplied in bolus form or in a drench form moving forward. So then we got to scanning. It wasn't too big a shock, but they were extremely low scanning percentage, the worst he'd ever seen. Now we put most of this down to the low body condition score, but we also investigated some of the barren use just to check for infectious disease. And we did identify a lot of toxoplasma antibodies in the blood. Toxoplasma is it can cause reaction of the fetus or abortion. This is just an image in the microscope of a placenta infected with a parasite, and what it's doing is just causing this massive bleed in the placenta and causing it to separate, and that's what's happening at the sheep and why it causes the effects you see. It's very common on farms. Some surveys suggest nearly all farms have some exposure to this, so it's something you need to know about when trying to investigate low scanning on your farms. And it can't just be down to, it's not necessarily just down to deficiency in the nutrition. We then did monitoring bloods 3 weeks before lambing. This was partly to assess the trace elements, but also just to manage the overall nutrition of the ewes. So we quite typically do metabolic profiles pre-lambing to assess how the sheep are coping on the ration they've got at the time, be it forage and some concentrate, and then to tailor any supplementation to ensure that their energy. At this point, the sheep show low energy and protein, and so we made feed adjustments in light of that to try and prevent any pregnancy toxemia or twin lamb disease. We took the opportunity to also just do blood analyses of the trace elements. You'd appreciate we didn't fancy taking liver biopsies of pregnant ewes at this point, but we could have done from cull ewes if that had been suggested. But we just did blood on the productive flock at this point, and copper was very low, frighteningly low, which kind of showed that the drench was inadequate. This wasn't unexpected totally, because we know that the drenches, in whatever form they're given, lived within the sheep. The selenium was more encouraging. It was only marginally low, and so the drench had been enough for what the sheep had required at that point. When I say marginally low, there's various thresholds, but it's not where at optimum, but it wasn't anywhere near low enough to cause major problems. The zinc was only marginally low as well, so the forage had essentially met the zinc needs within reason. Because of the extreme lowness of the copper in the blood, we took liver samples from newborn lambs that had died through other causes, so ones that had been laid on or were stillborn, just to see how much effect the copper in the ewe had an effect on the lamb. And all the 8 samples that we took were deficient. 5 were truly deficient, and 3 were less deficient, but still not at the optimum levels. Because of this and sort of the experience we'd had, we decided to supplement the ewes with copper primarily, but the bolus we used had selenium and cobalt in as well. We decided to supplement them as they left the lambing shed and going back to their pasture, because we knew when they were to get there, there was high molybdenum and sulfur, and we got data now to show that how that they use inside. So it sort of mops up the molybdenum and sulfur, and then what is left then gets absorbed by the sheep. We then did a further sampling in the summer after weaning. So these ewes go out to the pasture, they then rear their lambs, and then they were weaned in July, and we carried out further sampling a few weeks after weaning. This was to again monitor the effect and to make a new plan into the next breeding cycle. So throughout this, we wanted to do, I was encouraging him to do closer monitoring of the body condition score of the ewes, and to try and separate out thinner ewes and feed them to try and ensure we weren't in the same position as in 2018. We discussed using a toxoplasma vaccine because of the exposure to that disease on the farm, and the reasonable cost benefits that can be expected from using that. Again, because we know that this farm has disease issues, continue managing the worms and lameness and fluke. So we wanted to do a pre-tupping bolus, having learnt how to do it in the previous year, and having not investigated the lambs, but expecting them to perform in some way similar to their ewes, suggested that at weaning, selenium and cobalt might be useful for the smaller lambs in order to help them finish. So then, and I'm getting toward the end now, I realise we've slightly over half an hour. In the weaning, pre-tupping investigation, ewes were slightly improved on the year before, so they were near body condition score 2.0, but again they were below where we'd want them for tupping. We had a bit more time to get them there, but quite a lot of work to get them a target of 3.5 by tupping, and we didn't hit it, but we were certainly better off than the year before. At this stage in the summer, we were surprised in the feces analysis that we found adult fluke. Now that may have played a part why the sheep hadn't recovered as well as we'd hoped. And following summer, we had a mild winter, and this led, we think, to the infective stage of the fluke, the Metaceriaceae, not being killed off as much over the winter. So despite having treatments over the winter for adult fluke, they'd become reinfected, and we saw this on quite a lot of the farms. So we treated those with an adult flukicide, and then readjusted the plan moving forward for fluke control. In the bloods, we saw slightly low energy and protein, and protein could also have been impacted. The low protein could also be impacted by the fluke. So we took bloods again and biopsies again. In the copper, for copper, we found one sheep that was still low despite bolusing and so on. Half were normal, so the supplementation had worked, but 3 were above normal. They weren't in the toxic threshold, but they were above normal. So giving this bolus, we could manage copper relatively well. However, we're now in the position where to give any more could send the above normal ones toxic. Then to understand how the sheep were managing with the supplementations given. The selenium was low, so the selenium component of the bolus hadn't lasted as long as we'd hoped. The cobalt was okay, and the zinc was normal. So sort of moving forward, we wanted to improve the timing of the bolus, so move from ewes to a pre-tupping bolus in order that we supplement the ewe at the time she needs the trace element in order to produce a pregnancy, essentially. Then have a washout period afterwards to try and avoid going overdoing it and going toxic. In the meantime, we could supplement selenium pre-tupping quite easily with a drench, and then in the expectation that the copper would have declined somewhat in the ewes by scanning, we would do the copper and selenium again around scanning. So that is just to sort of give you a flavour of that it's not easy to sort it out straight away, and you know, that's just trying to show it as it is. Trace elements are not everything. On this farm, toxoplasma was also an issue. So infectious disease is important, but by far the most important lesson in this project was to conditions for the ewes regularly and try and optimize body condition score moving forward for the time of year and part of the production cycle you're in. Trace elements come secondary to that. They're important, but they come secondary to getting the grass, the body condition score optimized. So thank you for turning out this evening. Thank you for listening. I just need to acknowledge Dr. Nigel Kendall and Dr. Catherine Williams at the New Ventnor Laboratories at the University of Nottingham. They helped us with the project design and did all the analyses for us there. And then staff at Wern Vets who also helped with project management and all the donkey work of heaving sheep around. Thank you. And I think we're going to do questions now.
Yeah, that's it. Thank you very much, Joe. Thank you very much for that very interesting and very informative presentation. I know it's really hard to squeeze all of that information into 30 minutes, so I don't blame you for going over at all, but thank you very much for that very interesting talk. So now, as Joe said, we're going to open up the floor, as it were, for questions and answers. I think we've over 10 questions in already, so I will try my best to power through them all. Like I did mention, if we can't get through them all, we will make sure they are answered and the answer sent to you on email. So I'll start with the first question. So Joe, over the last few years, a lot of lambs from June onwards seem to be losing condition, and the only way to get them good enough to sell is to creep feed them. Why is this?
Okay, good question. The short answer is I don't know. On your farm exactly what's going on. There could be various things going on. To look at parasites, it would depend slightly when you're weaning them. You could be weaning them at that time, so it could be that they're struggling with the gut change from living off the milk to a degree and having to do it all off grass. There may be a trace element issue with that. There may be a cobalt issue with that. Yeah, there's some things to look at there. And hopefully from this talk, there'll be some ideas which you could start looking at. But don't lose heart. You may not solve it all in the first year, but you hopefully will start to make headway.
Good, thank you very much. We are losing a few words here and there from you, Joe, so hopefully everybody is still managing to understand correctly, but that's the joys of working with technology, unfortunately, but we did get the gist of that. Thank you very much. So second question, could you possibly mention any difference between standard sheep and primitive sheep also?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure where you're coming from on that question, but I'll try to. I don't know if there's anything such as a standard sheep, but perhaps you're thinking more about sort of commercial productive ewes compared to sort of more primitive genetics. Yes, there are breeds even within primitive sheep and within commercial ewes in the way they assimilate trace elements, and because we have such a diverse range of sheep in the UK, it would be important just to sort of look into the breed have, and then the issues it may or may not have. But certainly one thing in terms of trace elements, which I think is important to hammer home, is they're your sheep on your farm, and they may not perform the same as they would on your neighbour's farm, and they may do something different. So it's important to know what's going on in the grass and then also in the sheep in order to be able to see, are they doing what you expect? And that's where different tests come in.
Good, thank you very much. Another question. We use cobalt, iodine, selenium bolus. Should we be putting out mineral buckets as well?
I'm not sure. That sounds a bit overkill to me, in that you're providing two sources of supplementation. We did have one farmer using just mineral buckets. We advised boluses, and he chose to use mineral buckets because he felt the labour was less. But what we did notice in those blood results and liver results is that the range of the range for each element was much wider. So on his farm, he had one sheep we tested was toxic for copper, and then another that was severely deficient. So some ewes are licking the bucket a lot and some are not touching it. They're a more variable way of supplying trace elements. They're not a bad way to supply energy, although they can cost quite a lot. But in terms of trace elements, they're less reliable. I would look at the bolus you're using and just check through some testing whether it's delivering what you expect it to do, and if it's not, revisit that.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Could you just repeat the issue with the toxoplasmosis, as the audio broke up a bit? I think he's referring to the slide where you were showing why the scanning percentage was so low in 2018, 2019.
Yeah, sure. And I'm sorry about the audio. We should have, it's how it is with the interweb.
Yeah, not your fault, Joe. Nothing we can do about it.
So yeah, this farm, he had low scanning percentage. We thought a lot of it was due to the poor body condition of the ewes tapping, and that was likely true. Some of the barren ewes detect antibodies to toxoplasma. That means at some point they've been exposed to toxoplasma. Now we know this parasite can cause early fetal death and reabsorption, or it can cause abortion later on. We think that was also part of the problem in the scanning. And looking at the history, we didn't have time to go into it all, but in the history of this farm, his scanning was creeping down year on year, and so toxoplasma may have been playing a role in that as well.
Okay, thank you very much. What's the best way to stop staggers in ewes when trying to cut out concentrates?
Yeah, challenging. And at one farm that, again, we were particularly trying to deal with. I mean, I find mag buckets seem to make the problem go away when they have access to the magnesium. There are other ways of supplementing with magnesium, boluses and things, but it's hard to predict when it's going to come, because it depends on the weather and the speed of the grass grows. Yes, it can be challenging. There's one farm where it doesn't matter what he does, he's still having problems. So I think it's going to be a sort of try it and see approach.
There we are. Thank you very much. There's a few questions here just on the cost of sheep blood tests and the liver tests as well.
Yeah. So they are expensive. Whichever laboratory you use, they're expensive. Now, we chose to use Nottingham because they're using some newer tests, some of which aren't fully validated in sheep, but part of them using them in sheep to see if they were going to be useful. So the other labs that do it just look at plasma or serum copper, for example, or just do glutathione peroxidase rather than plasma selenium and glutathione. So we went for Nottingham because they gave the broadest panel of give you any interpretation with it. You have to consult somebody else to interpret it for you. So they can vary. So some labs charge about £7 per test per sheep. In Nottingham, it's quite a bit more than that, but you get a lot more for your money. So they just do combined trace elements, which from memory is about £30 a ewe, but you get about 8 or 9 different tests for that money as you buy it as a package. Yes, if you do quite a lot together, you do save some money because they group them together, and that makes it easier for them to run their machines. I think if you're looking at doing it, there's not a one size fits all approach, and we did a very in-depth investigation because we were trying to sort of feel our way through it. But there would be cheaper ways to approach it, but it might take a lot longer to get to where you wanted to go in terms of sort of cherry pick tests out to do. So I know it's quite a complicated question to answer. So I know it doesn't quite answer it, but I think if you're interested in exploring it, then talk to whoever's going to do it for you. The first thing, but sort of try and figure out the best way to investigate and what's going to be the most cost effective for the farm.
Brilliant, thank you very much. There's a few questions as well on what works better, what method of supplementation, bolus or drench?
Depends on what you're trying to supplement for. So for copper, probably a bolus if you need it for a long time, which you tend to. So drenches and injections are fairly short-lived for copper. Bolus is much longer, and not all boluses are made equal. Some last longer than others. For selenium, because it becomes enzyme bound, it lasts longer from a drench, but you could also apply it in a bolus if you needed something else to give. Cobalt, very short-lived from a drench, so you need to give it repeatedly if you're going to supply it in that way, or use a bolus, or you can jump the gun and use a vitamin B12 injection. So I think again, try not just to make your decisions in isolation. It's tempting just to go, I'll try this product, but talk to somebody to help you work out the best product for your situation.
Yeah, thank you very much. If I could just mention quickly, we actually did a Farming Connect, well, 2 Farming Connect trials during the last year on trace element supplementation methods. So we did one trial with South Wales farm vets comparing cobalt supplementation, so using bolus and the smart shot injection, and comparing their daily live weight gains, and we didn't see any difference whatsoever between them. And then another one comparing the cobalt, iodine, selenium, and copper bolus with a monthly drench, and I think it was 2 types of boluses, and again they didn't see any significant difference between the methods of trace element supplementation. So like you said, it might come down to cost or ease of labor. Just depends what suits the farm and the farmer, really.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, I presume that was done in lambs because it could be more challenging to give monthly drenches to pregnant ewes, whereas lambs, you're often doing something with them each month, so you can do that. So I think, so it depends on what you're trying to achieve and what the issues are as to what you might want to give. Because if you've got lambs that need to finish in a few weeks, the drench is probably going to be cheap because you're going to be handling them all the time, and maybe sufficient depending on the elements you need. There's a lot of variables to handle, and I think the reason there are so many products out there is because there isn't a one size fits all.
Yeah, definitely. Right, questions are still coming through. I don't think we'll manage to get through them all this evening, or we'll be here until 12 o'clock this evening. But I think I'll try and squeeze 1 or 2 more in, and then, like I said, If we haven't managed to answer your question, we will email you the answer at a later time. Okay, so one person asking, how did the liver and blood samples compare?
Yes, well, I'm still doing that analysis, so I can't fully answer it, but they were quite different. So they were quite different at some points, and at some points they were similar. And the livers were low, and some we found that the livers were normal and the bloods were low. And I think that reflects the fact that they are measuring different things. What we did find was certainly in going into these farms blind, not really having any knowledge of what was going on with trace elements, that having all the information was really useful in making a plan. But then in terms of monitoring, we're likely to scale it back, just because it gets expensive doing all the tests all the time, and just focus on the fine tuning it, probably just using blood or maybe abattoir samples.
Brilliant, thank you very much. One question to finish off then, I think. When would you recommend the best time to give trace elements boluses to sheep before tupping?
Yeah, good. So at least, I like to do at least a month before tupping, just so it's sort of bedded in. And a lot of the boluses, say they last 6 months, and a lot of my clients would do some supplementary feeding in a month before lambing. So I want it to wear off at that point, to get the most out of it. It needs to go in a little bit before tupping, so that they're already in the system, so the ewes can tup well. But yeah, a couple of weeks would be fine, but I usually try and do it a little bit before that, so it's already on board, and so that it then runs out when they start concentrate feeding.